I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just stood there in my own driveway, holding a casserole dish I'd brought because I thought my brother might be hungry after the move, and watched my sister-in-law tell me I wasn't welcome inside my own family's home. That was the moment I decided I was done. But let me back up, because the story doesn't start there. It starts 3 years ago, in a hospital waiting room that smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic, when my dad squeezed my hand and told me he didn't have much time left. My dad's name was Raymond. He was a retired electrician from outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of man who fixed his neighbor's porch lights without being asked, and kept a 20 in his wallet specifically for tipping. He wasn't rich. He wasn't even comfortable, not really. He had a modest house, a truck that needed new brakes every other year, and a savings account he'd been building since I was in diapers. When he died, he left behind a paid-off house valued at around $190,000, a small life insurance payout of $40,000, and 3 kids, me, my older brother Kevin, and my younger half-brother from his second marriage, Theo. I was 31, Kevin was 38, Theo was 24. Dad didn't have a complicated will. He split everything 3 ways, equal shares. The house was to be sold and divided. The insurance money split between us. He'd written it himself with an estate attorney in town, and it was clean, legal, and completely clear. I want you to understand something about my family before I tell you what happened next. Kevin had always been the golden child. Not in a way my dad ever pushed. My dad wasn't like that. But in a way Kevin had decided for himself. He was the oldest. He'd gone to college. He'd married a woman named Serena, who had opinions about everything and feelings about nothing. They'd moved to a nicer suburb of Columbus, while I stayed closer to Dad in our hometown, an hour out. I was the one who drove him to his chemo appointments. I was the one who stocked his fridge and picked up his prescriptions and spent every other weekend sitting with him while he watched old westerns and pretended he wasn't tired. I'm not saying that to make myself sound like a martyr. I'm saying it because what came next made it very clear that none of that mattered to Kevin, and it mattered even less to Serena. Dad passed in March. By April, Kevin had already started talking about the house. He called me one evening, friendly enough at first, and floated the idea that instead of selling, maybe he and Serena should just buy out my share and Theo's share and keep it in the family. He threw out a number that was about $30,000 below what any reasonable appraisal would show. I told him I'd think about it. I wasn't trying to be difficult. I genuinely wanted to consider it, but I also had a gut feeling, the kind you get when you've known someone your whole life and you recognize when they're being smooth on purpose. I asked Theo what he thought. Theo, who is the most easygoing person I have ever met in my life, said, and I quote, "I just don't want drama," which meant he'd probably take whatever Kevin offered. I didn't say anything yet. I just quietly called a realtor I knew from high school and asked her to walk through the house and give me an informal estimate. She came back with a number. The house was worth closer to $205,000. Kevin's offer would have shorted me and Theo each by about $10,000. I kept that to myself for a little while. Meanwhile, Kevin and Serena had started spending time at the house on weekends. Cleaning it out, they said. Going through Dad's things. I didn't have a problem with that in theory. But when I drove up one Saturday to help, I found that quite a lot of Dad's things had already been decided. His woodworking tools, a full set, well kept, probably worth $2,000 or more, were in the back of Kevin's truck. His vintage fishing gear was gone. The good cast iron cookware that had been in our family for 30 years was nowhere in the kitchen. I asked Kevin about the tools. He said Dad had told him he could have them. I asked when. He said before he died. I said I'd been with Dad almost every week for 2 years, and Dad had never mentioned that. Kevin shrugged. Serena, from across the room, said, "Raymond talked to Kevin about a lot of things." I let it go. I shouldn't have, but I did. Over the next month, Kevin pushed harder on the buyout idea. He'd upgraded his number slightly, still below market, and now he was adding conditions. He wanted to deduct the cost of the work he and Serena had done cleaning the house. I asked what work. He produced a handwritten list that included things like organizing belongings and general cleaning and estimated the total at about $4,500. I want to be clear about something. I had spent the last 2 years of my father's life making sure he was taken care of. I had used my own paid time off to drive him to treatments. I had spent money on groceries, on gas, on the little things he needed that he was too proud to ask for. I had never once asked to be compensated for any of it, and I never intended to. I did it because he was my dad. But Kevin cleaning the kitchen for a weekend was worth $4,500 in deductions from my inheritance. I still didn't say anything. I'm a person who processes slowly. I need to sit with things before I react. My therapist says it's a strength. That particular month, it felt more like a curse. What finally broke it open wasn't the money. It was the Sunday afternoon in May when I drove up to the house, which was still legally in the estate, not Kevin's property, and found the locks had been changed. I stood on my dad's front porch and put my key in the door, and it didn't turn. I tried it twice. I went around to the back door. Same thing. I called Kevin. He didn't answer. I texted him. He texted back 20 minutes later. We had to change the locks for security. We'll get you a key soon. I asked Arena. She said there'd been some concern about the neighborhood, which was a quiet neighborhood where my dad had lived for 26 years without incident, and that they'd felt it was necessary. She used the phrase for everyone's protection. I want to pause here and tell you something, because I think it's important. I am not a confrontational person by nature. I grew up trying to keep the peace. I spend most of my adult life being the person who absorbs things quietly to avoid making waves. My dad used to joke that I had more patience than anyone he'd ever met. I took that as a compliment for a long time. But standing on my dead father's porch, with a key that didn't work, having just cleaned his bathroom and organized his medications and held his hand while he took his last breath, something in me went very quiet and very clear. I got back in my car, I drove home, and I called an estate attorney. Her name was Phyllis, and she'd been practicing for over 20 years. She listened to everything I told her, the tools, the cleaning deductions, the below-market buyout offer, the locks. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay, here's what you're going to do." What followed was a certified letter to Kevin and to the executor of the estate, which was a bank-appointed third party, another thing Kevin had not fully considered, formally objecting to any unilateral decisions about the property, formally requesting an accounting of all items removed from the estate, and formally notifying all parties that I would not accept any buyout below fair market value as determined by a licensed appraiser. Kevin called me the night he got the letter. He wasn't friendly anymore. He said I was making things difficult. He said I was being greedy. He said Dad would be ashamed of me. That one landed, I'm not gonna lie. I had to sit down. I pressed my back against the wall of my apartment and I let him say it and I breathed through it. Then I said, "Kevin, I'll see you at the appraisal." He hung up. Serena texted me an hour later. It was a long message and most of it isn't worth repeating, but the part that I think about most was near the end. She said that I had never been the one who really stepped up for Dad. She said Kevin had done so much that I didn't see. She listed things Kevin had supposedly handled, conversations he'd supposedly had, decisions he'd supposedly made on Dad's behalf. I had been there. I knew what was real and what wasn't, but what struck me most was the confidence of it, the way she just rewrote the story, clean and complete like she'd been rehearsing it. I didn't respond to her message. I forwarded it to Phyllis. The appraisal came in at $208,500. Kevin's last offer had been $117,400 for the whole house, meaning he'd pay me and Theo each about $58,000. At fair market value, my share should have been closer to $69,500. He came back with $180,000, still short, still with the cleaning deductions attached. I said no. He said he'd make it ugly. I said that was his choice. This is the part of the story where I want to be honest about something. There was a piece of me that just wanted it to be over. I was grieving. I was exhausted. Kevin is my brother, and whatever he had become in his marriage, I still remembered the person who taught me to ride a bike in our parents' driveway. Letting go of that version of him was its own kind of loss, separate from losing Dad, and it hurt in a different way. But I also knew that if I folded, I would be carrying that for the rest of my life, not the money. The knowledge that I had let someone take something from me that my father had worked his whole life to leave me. So I held. The estate went through formal probate proceedings. Kevin hired his own attorney. There were several very unpleasant months of back and forth that I'm going to spare you in detail. The house went on the open market. It sold in 6 weeks for $211,000. After fees and closing costs, the estate netted just under $196,000. Split 3 ways, my share was $65,200. Kevin also had to account for the items removed from the house, the woodworking tools, the fishing gear, the cast iron, a few other things that had turned up in the accounting. He could keep them, but their appraised value, about $3,400, was deducted from his share. His cleaning deductions were denied entirely. I don't know what the final conversation between Kevin and his attorney looked like. I wasn't there. I only know that the check arrived, correctly calculated, and that I sat with it in my hands for a long time before I deposited it. Theo called me after it was all done. He'd gone along with the formal process once it became clear that was the path, and he'd ended up with more than Kevin's original offer would have given him too. He didn't say much. Just, "I'm sorry it got that bad." I told him it wasn't his fault. I meant it. The casserole dish moment, the one I started with, came a few weeks after everything was settled. Kevin and Serena had not spoken to me since the closing. I'd found out through Theo that they bought a different house, new construction outside of town. I don't know why I thought bringing food might help. Maybe I was trying to be the person who reached first. Maybe I just needed to know I tried. I pulled up to the house. Serena answered the door before I even knocked. She must have seen me pull in. She looked at the casserole dish and then at me and said, "Kevin doesn't want any contact right now." Just like that. I said, "Can I at least leave this?" She said, "I think it's better if you go." I stood there for a moment. I looked past her into the house and I caught a glimpse of Kevin in the kitchen doorway. He saw me. He looked away. I turned around and walked back to my car. I drove home. I put the casserole in my own fridge and I sat at my kitchen table and I cried, which I hadn't really let myself do since Dad's funeral. Not for the money, not for Kevin's choices, for the brother I'd had once, and for my dad, who had wanted so much for us to take care of each other. But then I did something else. I took out the folder I'd kept through the whole process. Every email, every certified letter, every document, every text message. I sat with it all laid out in front of me, and what I felt underneath the grief was something I hadn't felt in a long time. I had stood my ground, not out of greed, not out of revenge, out of a simple, quiet insistence that what was fair, that my father's wishes meant something, that the years I had given, freely and without asking, did not obligate me to accept less than what I was owed when someone decided to take advantage of them. My dad didn't raise me to roll over. He raised me to be patient, yes, to be fair, to give people the benefit of the doubt. But he also fixed his neighbor's porch lights without being asked. And when someone tried to underpay him for a job, he handed back the check and walked away. I kept my folder. I still have it. Not because I'm waiting for something, just because sometimes when I need to remember that I'm capable of holding on to what's right even when it's hard, I open it up and I look at that appraisal number and that final settlement amount, and I think about my dad's hands, the way they looked when he worked, the way they felt when he held mine in that hospital room. He would have said I handled it well. I think he would have meant it. The last thing I'll say is this. My phone number hasn't changed. Kevin has it. If he ever decides he wants to find his way back, I'm not going anywhere. That door is open. The locks, at least on my end, were never changed. I still have the appraisal document in a folder on my kitchen shelf. I don't look at it often, but I know it's there, and knowing that is enough. People ask me sometimes, friends, mostly, whether I regret how it all went, whether I wish I'd just taken Kevin's first offer and been done with it. And I understand why they ask. It would have been easier. It would have been quieter. There would have been no certified letters, no probate proceedings, No standing on my dad's porch with a key that no longer worked. There would have been a check and an uncomfortable Thanksgiving, and probably a version of normal that slowly stitched itself back together the way families do when they decide, collectively, to pretend. But I keep coming back to something my dad said to me once, not near the end, but years before, when I was maybe 19 and upset about something at work. Someone had taken credit for something I'd done, and I'd let it go because I didn't want to cause problems. He listened to the whole story, and then he said, "Nat, being patient isn't the same thing as being a pushover. Know the difference." I didn't fully understand that until I was standing in my car in that driveway, watching Serena close the door. What I've come to understand about Kevin is that he wasn't acting out of cruelty exactly. He was acting out of habit. He had spent his whole life being the one who got more attention, more credit, more benefit of the doubt, and at some point that stopped feeling like luck and started feeling like something he was owed. When Dad died and left things equal, it felt to Kevin like he'd been shorted, and so he moved, quickly and competently, to correct it. The deductions, the low offer, the locks, none of it was malicious in the way a villain is malicious. It was just a person who had never learned to account honestly for what belonged to someone else. That's a different kind of problem, and it doesn't get fixed by giving in to it. What I had to develop, slowly, over those months, was the ability to hold two things at once. I had to be honest enough with myself to know I wasn't fighting for the money out of greed. I genuinely wasn't. I was fighting because the alternative was accepting a version of events that wasn't true, and I'd spent enough of my life quietly accepting versions of things that weren't true to know what that costs you over time. It costs you the ability to trust your own memory. It costs you the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you stood for something when it mattered. I also had to be clear-eyed in a way I hadn't always been. Phyllis asked me once early on what outcome I was actually hoping for. Not what I wanted legally. What I wanted. I told her I wanted my share, correctly calculated, without deductions for things that weren't legitimate. She nodded and said, "Good, that's a real answer. We can work with that." I think that moment mattered more than I realized at the time. Being precise about what you're actually after keeps you from fighting for the wrong things or fighting longer than you need to. And then there's the part that nobody really talks about, which is just the endurance of it. The months of sitting with something unresolved, the nights I second-guessed myself, the phone calls I didn't take from Kevin because I knew they would shake me if I let them. The act of simply continuing to trust what I knew, continuing to show up for the process, continuing to not fold. That was its own kind of work. Not dramatic, not heroic, just one foot in front of the other, over and over, until there was ground on the other side. The door on my end is still open. I meant that when I said it, and I still mean it. But the terms have changed, not punishingly, just honestly. I know what I'm worth now in a way I maybe didn't before. My dad left me that too, I think, not in the will. In the example of a man who did fair work and expected fair return and walked away quietly when he didn't get it. That's the inheritance that doesn't get divided.